Hello, I'm Bob Trubshaw. I'd like to talk to you today about, something that's so unusual, even the experts don't have a consistent name for them. Some refer to them as skew passages, others use the term passage squints, and one of them's even referred to as a walk-through squint. But we'll sort all that out a little later. Most of you will be familiar with a famous children's story which involves a whole world discovered by parting the fur coats in the back of a wardrobe. Well, something similar happened in 2013 when Martin Palmer, who's an expert on church buildings, pulled back a curtain inside Avebury Church. Frankly, given all the other attractions in St James's Church at Avebury, there's Anglo-Saxon windows, Anglo-Saxon sculpture fragments, a wonderful 12th century font, doorway of the same sort of age, medieval floor tiles, a restored pre-Reformation rood screen, a parish chest from the 17th century, a piece of bell frame dated 1636, and, much else. So frankly, the curtain at the eastern side of the north aisle is rather easily overlooked. And even those curious enough to pull back the curtain would see it's hiding a bunging space for stackable chairs and such like. Only the more astute would try to look past the chairs or try to work out how old the doorway is. Only an expert would see that this is not a normal feature of parish churches. Looking past the stacks of chairs reveals a view of the altar and reredos at the east end of the chancel. This bunging space is at an angle to the rest of the church. This is what's behind the curtain at the east end of the north aisle. At the right of the photograph are the stairs to the former rood loft. And this photograph is looking back the other way from the chancel. The choir stalls in the foreground are late 19th century innovations, so would not have been present when the doorway was built. The doorway looks 15th century, and this is something that was intentionally added before the Reformation. Walking to the north side of the church and looking at this feature from the outside reveals that it looks rather like a lean-to addition, although as it survived for well over 500 years, it's clearly built a bit more solidly than most lean-tos. Why go to all the trouble? Well, there's one well-attested reason and one plausible reason. I'll deal with the well-known reason first and come back to the plausible one a little later in this video. Before the Reformation there would have been an altar at the eastern end of the north aisle, as well as in the chancel. The evidence for this still survives as a small piscina set into the wall beside the pulpit. This would have been used to rinse the vessels used in the Mass, with the water draining away into the rubble core of the wall. This second altar meant that more than one priest could celebrate Mass at the same time. And part of the liturgical niceties is that both priests should elevate the host at the same time. But all that's needed to synchronise this is a much smaller aperture. Indeed, between the south aisle and the chancel apron is just such an angled aperture, and known to architectural historians as squints, and are relatively common. But walk-through squints, which is the best way of describing the structure leading from the north aisle at Avebury, are not at all common. Indeed, this was the first one I'd knowingly encountered. The English Heritage listing for Avebury Church simply refers to there being two squints, so there was no obvious way to search for other examples of these walk-through squints. I just let the matter rest for a few months, wondering how I might track down other examples of these walk-through squints. And then, shortly before Christmas 2014, the weather was sunny and mild, and my partner fancied a day out. Such trips require a lunch break, and the pub at Shurston seemed the best option. But it wasn't quite midday yet, so a bit too early to order food. We decided to take a look inside the rather impressive-looking parish church. It's a splendid edifice, complete with central tower and transepts. We went inside. I walked from the nave into the chancel, and then turned to go towards the north transept. Only after I'd got to the transept did I do a double take. I'd just walked through a very impressive walk-through squint. It's roughly the same date as Avebury, but bigger and wider. It's even got a mullioned window facing out to the northeast. No curtains or stacks of chairs here. This is the view looking eastwards from the north transept towards the chancel. And this photograph shows the passageway on the right. Now, once I got back home, the plot started to thicken. I looked up English heritage listing for Shurston, and lo and behold, the feature was referred to as a walk through Squint. Aha! Just the phrase I need to search the English heritage database to come up with more examples. No. Doing that only brought up Shurston. But playing around with the search terms revealed references to passage squints, and searching for these brought forth quite a few. Pembrokeshire has the most, 9 examples listed, all at seemingly quite minor places. If you really must know, they're at Cwm Cwan, Jeffreyston, Llanstadwell, Martluthi, Rosquadder, Rosemarket, St Florence, Skethau and Usmarston. No, I hadn't heard of most of them either. Subsequently, I discovered that the term skew passage was also used to refer to the same feature. Relevant databases once again show that Wales has the most, with Pembrokeshire yielding a still existing example at Gumfreston and a possible but since removed example at Cwmhre. The other skew passages behind side aisles and chancels in Wales are at Bosherton, which is in Dyfed, Llangynin in Carmarthenshire, where there's actually evidence for 2 former skew passages from both the north and south aisles, St Ishmael's in Carmarthenshire, and St Twynwl's in Dyfed again. Gloucestershire has 6 passage squints: Beverston, Bledington, Colesbourne, North Sherney, Sevenhampton and Tormarton. Idbury almost counts as well, although it's actually in Oxfordshire. It's only a stone's throw from the Gloucestershire border, and Idbury is actually about 2 miles to the south of Bledington. There's no obvious reason why 2 churches with passage squints would be in such close proximity. Berkshire had 1 passage squint, Stanford in the Vale, but it lost it in 1974 when the village was transferred to Oxfordshire. Further afield, Cornwall has 2 surviving examples, St Morgan and Curry, while the passage squint at Manacan, the passageway has since been partially blocked. The online information for Pillerton in Cornwall is that the squint may be large enough to walk through, but it's a bit ambiguous, so I'm not sure about that. There are 3 more examples, 1 in Derbyshire, 1 in Monmouthshire and 1 in Norfolk. Quite clearly these English heritage listings are inconsistently written. Presumably some listing inspectors just called all squints, just that, and didn't distinguish passage squints. Some did, and then in Wales, the term skew passage was used. Whoever listed the Shurston church seemingly did not know the term passage squint and used the term walk-through squint. And quite plausibly, this apparent profusion in Pembrokeshire and Gloucestershire is simply a result of the relevant inspectors having little more knowledge of the nomenclature. But using Google to track down other examples of these phrases produced some of the examples listed above, but didn't suggest there was any significant bias in the English heritage listings. OK, well, why were they built? I'm going to suggest it's quite simple. Crowd control. Now, these days it's hard to imagine unruly crowds in a church. The only times that churches are full is usually for weddings and funerals. But things were different before the Reformation. Churches were dedicated to one or sometimes more saints, and saints had one or more feast days. And there may well have been relics of the saint or saints near the altar. And people would come from near and far for these feasts and a chance to be near and perhaps briefly touch the reliquaries that house the relics. The best of these relics would have brought people on pilgrimages over quite some distance, and the pilgrims would have stopped off, indeed stayed overnight, in churches along their route. Avebury presumably had relics of St James, and was almost certainly a local pilgrimage destination. It's the junction of the London to Bath Bristol Road, and it's on the north-south routes, either along the Winterbourne Valley or upon the Ridgeway. Pilgrims heading to various major shrines, including Reading and Canterbury, could have converged here before going off along what's now the A4. We can assume quite reasonably that on the Feast of St James, which is the 25th of July, Avebury Church could attract thousands of visitors, each of whom would want to touch or kiss the reliquary. Now, we have some contemporary reports of such feast days at continental churches, and this describes how we can get an awful lot of pushing and shoving, if not worse. So clearly, the church wardens needed to come up with a way to control the crowds. So although any direct evidence is lacking, there does seem to be a tradition that pilgrims gathered in the North Aisle. They perhaps also slept overnight in the North Aisle, and then went into the chancel in a clockwise direction. After touching the reliquary, they would leave the chancel westward through the chancel arch into the nave. So, having one group of people getting into the chancel on the North Aisle while others are leaving or just dawdling around, it sounds like a recipe for confusion. So the passage squints, like those at Avebury and Shurston, would avoid this problem, because the people entering the chancel would go through the squint. And you can imagine a couple of stout blokes, beadles or deacons, at the chancel end of these squints, and they could just effectively control the number of people entering the chancel any one time and make sure it didn't get overcrowded. In other words, the people leaving had actually made their way out. So if you want to think, the squint is acting as a funnel and the beadles are some sort of tap. Now, it sounds like a good way of managing large numbers of visitors, but I have to say there's no evidence that beadles or deacons were used in this way. But it is the sort of scenario which seems to justify going to all the trouble of building a passage squint. Other things happened in North Isles at the time of pilgrims. Wealthier groups of pilgrims would have travelled with their own priest, and from surviving accounts it seems the priest said Mass each morning before the group set off for the day. Presumably, these priests used the altars at the east end of the North Aisle. Whether the parish priest also said Mass at the same time at the main altar is an open question, but the presence of a very simple look-through squint would have been sufficient to synchronise. It's certainly not the reason to build a passage squint. Now, in a further little turn of this tale, it seems that passage squints could be used as evidence for medieval pilgrimage routes. I simply wasn't familiar with all the minor places in Gloucestershire where English heritage listed these passage squints. However, as I plotted them out on a map, I realised that Colesbourne, Beverston, North Cerney, Tormenton, Shurston were all along a roughly north-south route. And it's not that far from either Tetbury or Cirencester, which were important pilgrimage shrines in their own right. Seemingly, the more minor Gloucestershire churches had, like Avebury, been adapted to cope with large numbers of visitors. The modern-day dedications of these churches didn't shed any light, but there's somewhere at the end of that southerly route which certainly does shed light, and that's the parish church at Marshfield. Let's just look at this map. The passage squints are shown as red dots. Places which are known to be associated with pilgrimage are shown with blue dots. Blue and yellow dots, and the church is dedicated to St James, the patron saint of pilgrims. And I've added these green arrows to indicate the probable pilgrimage routes. There's another route running from Marlborough to Burbage, here with a red arrow, would have been the main route down to Winchester in Anglo-Saxon times, following a Roman road and what's known as the Chute Causeway. Interestingly, there are no known passage squints to the south of the Bristol to London road, the modern A4, but there are a surprising number of dedications to St James. Don't know what that tells us, I'm just sort of passing that on. So like Avebury and Cherrell, Marshfield Church sits on the original course of the London to Bath or Bristol road. It's dedicated to St James, patron saint of pilgrims. All three churches have long established routeways running to the north or the northeast, bringing people from the Midlands down to Bristol. Marshfield is about 1 day's walk from the docks at Bristol. And intriguingly, Bristol's docks had a hospital dedicated to St James right by the quay. The building survives, but it's no longer a hospital. Anyone in medieval times coming down these routes from the Midlands who was not intent on going to Bristol could actually have gone down to about Avebury and turned east onto what's now the A4. They'd then be heading to Reading, and the abbey there had a major relic of St James. It was his arm. It was lost at the Reformation. Beyond Reading, there was London, and beyond there was Canterbury, and the sink ports such as Dover, so you could catch a boat over to get to the continental pilgrimage places like Rome and, of course, Jerusalem. Intriguingly, the only passage squint known to me on the route used from Reading to Canterbury is at St Mary's Church in Guildford. It's one of the oldest churches in the town, and the tower may date back to the 10th century. An author called Mary Anderson wrote in a book published in 1949, "Returning to Guildford, In St Mary's, the slanting passages which lead from the high altar to the transeptal chapels and the unusual eastern apses of these chapels are strongly suggestive of a plan influenced by the need to accommodate processions of pilgrims passing before the holy relics. That's a book called Looking for History in British Churches. And again, at St Mary's in Guildford, there's a second look-through squint as well as the walk-through squint. The look-through one is in the south aisle, and the walk-through one is from the north aisle. So that whole string of churches in Gloucestershire with passage squints seemingly confirms that the walk-through squint at Avebury is part of the response to large numbers of visitors on patronal feast days, and perhaps also when other large groups of pilgrims came through. Big question, well, is there any similar evidence for pilgrimage routes elsewhere in England? Graham Jones has identified what he calls a corridor of churches dedicated to St James running from Bristol all the way up to Stoke Orchard near Gloucester and across to Warwickshire and Leicestershire. And he's also picked up another cluster which linked together eastern Herefordshire with northern Buckinghamshire and going through Worcestershire and South Northamptonshire. And I'm aware of 3 churches dedicated to St Thomas of Becket in Leicestershire. One near Melton on the Mowbray at the village of Frisby on the Reek, the other 2 in adjoining villages to the east of Leicester, Skeffington and Tugby. And it's been suggested that these are on a route from Nottinghamshire, which would take people towards North Norfolk and Walsingham. And Walsingham was the nearest nationally important shrine to the East Midlands. Not coincidentally, it was on the same route as the wool trade to the East Coast ports. If you think East Anglia is a little remote from Wessex, well, think again. One of the various former Roman roads known as the Icknield Way, there are several Icknield Ways, but the one we're talking about begins right in the north of Norfolk, and Wells next to the sea, runs southwestwards through Walsingham, Swaffham, Newmarket, Luton, Goring-on-Thames. It actually crosses the Thames, of course, and from here onwards it's known as the Ridgeway. It follows the northern edge of the Berkshire Downs towards Swindon, Avebury again, and the Salisbury Plain. And there's no reason why in medieval times someone from Wiltshire, Avebury, would not be setting off towards Walsingham using exactly that route. So, sometimes just pulling back a curtain can lead to a whole new realm of ideas.